Hello.
Hey.
All right. I don't know if Jesse's here or not. We'll have to wait for him. How are you, Amanda?
I'm good. How are you guys?
All right. Okay. So what do we want to talk about today?
Yeah, so I read the Anticipatory Systems like explanation from that other author.
Yeah, the H. Louie.
Yes.
And what was your impression? Yeah.
I thought it was very helpful. It was pretty surface level. I was hoping they would get into like some of the specifics. I didn't realize how important the concept of a model was. I thought that was interesting, especially in relation to the Every Good Regulator Theorem.
What are we talking about?
Just general thoughts on the Anticipatory Systems paper.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is Robert Rosen's Anticipatory Systems. So this is just a baseline, getting us up to speed on what that is, which is probably good because it's kind of like, it can be very difficult because I've seen papers where they do a lot of mathematical formulation and that can obscure what's actually going on. So, the ubiquity of anticipatory systems in nature is explained. Causality is not violated by anticipatory systems. And teleology is an integral aspect of science. That's the findings. Practical implications, a terse exposition for a general readership. Then the value is the topic of anticipatory systems in particular, and methods of relational biology in general, provide important tools for foresight studies. So I don't know what foresight studies are.
Yeah, I haven't heard that term before.
I don't know, maybe that has something to do with like, I don't know, futurism or something. But I guess
it's not okay.
Oh, go ahead.
I know it's the Foresight Institute, but I don't know.
Well, it's not a word. Yeah.
Well, but it's it is predicting it is seeing into the future, right?
Yeah.
So magically.
So that I had never run across that expression or the way that they make that. So yeah, let's see.
Well, I'm certainly used to forecasting methods.
Oh yeah. I mean that's that's maybe where it's sort of the larger idea of forecasting. And of course, forecasting you can just do with statistics and say, I give this prediction a certain probability, or it could use a Bayesian model where you have like this conditional probability given certain things, something will happen. And then you can actually have, but in this case, they're talking about in biological systems where you don't have that formal statistical model. And of course, people might argue that, like say in the brain, that, there's this sort of representation of a statistical model or something similar. But, it's not, there's no evidence of that necessarily. And even then, you're dealing with systems that are sort of lower than representations, I guess. Like instead of like neural circuits, you might have like a cell or like a transcriptional system. So like anticipatory systems would be where you'd have some system that can see like potential threats to its viability in advance, or they can prepare for it. So if there's a need for water, the system is poised to take advantage of water when it becomes available. Or it can, do some purposeful behavior to get to the source of energy or something like that. So, I mean, that's kind of where I've seen it before in biology. Like people, used it in that way. Go ahead.
That's interesting that you give the water example, because we were talking last night about there was that line that was real quick that was like the difference between a river and something with agency. I forget the wording. It's like if a river runs out of water, you wouldn't attribute failure to it. But if an animal can't find water, then in some cases, some examples of that, we would attribute a kind of failure to the animal.
Yeah.
And I thought that this concept of anticipatory systems allows you to like tease apart why the river is not a case of some kind of failure, but the animal would be, because it would be like a failure of anticipation. A river is just not the kind of thing that can, I don't know, anticipate, plan in advance. So that's not the kind of thing that could go wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so yeah, it's like you might have a system that senses, the environment and then can say, if the conditions are in such a way, you do this. If conditions are another type of way, you do this. So they're almost like, programmatic responses to certain conditions, which is sort of like a conditional probability, but it doesn't rely on that model. It's just kind of like, maybe like you could build that with a logical circuit, which you could build with maybe some gene expression circuit. I mean, it's plausible.
A river versus a dam controller.
Yeah, or like yeah.
Sort of. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
But actually, it's funny you mention that, because if you think about like a river, it's a ramifying structure, a branching structure. You often have like tributaries that come into the river, and so if those tributaries, it's not that they switch on and off purposefully, but if one tributary doesn't come into the river, they say it dries up, then it affects the whole flow of the river. It can affect the energetics up and down the river. And so, the river wouldn't have anticipatory mechanisms to sort of compensate for that. So that, and then of course, those are like those sort of, there's a sensitivity to those inputs. So if you have, maybe certain key tributaries that dry up, you get like a river that's much less productive than if other tributaries have dried up. It's like you can just take the inputs to the river, to the flow, and switch them on and off and see what the effects are. There's no logical circuit there. It's just kind of like the consequences of that. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, this is so. I guess in thinking about this, if you think about like cybernetic machines and cybernetics, there's this whole issue of like purpose, and I'm not like a great fan of that idea, but like they do have this implication of purpose. So like in a cybernetic machine, there's this sort of purposefulness in teleological aspect of it, and it's kind of the way they deal with it in cybernetics, and that predates Rosen. They kind of lay this out, and then they say, well, this is, the way that feedback is controlled. This is sort of the idea of good control and good regulation. So, okay, so let's see. Is purposefulness part of cybernetics? The things we have wanted to look at more in depth in the future.
I remember us talking about this, and like I know there's been a number of things come up in the context of like the reimagining cybernetic stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to remember specifically, like, because I'm trying to think. Oh, that's right. Didn't you like put together like a paper or an outline of a paper or something about that too? I forget.
Yeah.
I'm just feeling a bunch of parts that I know are somewhere. I'm trying to collect them all in my own notes. So.
Well, we're working on this paper, but I mean, there are other things that we can do. We've talked a lot about these issues, and we also have, there's a set of terms. We did the glossary thing on GitHub, and that's old, but that's something that we talked about this with Cognition Futures, where we have this glossary. So we have the terms, and then we have the standard definitions, but then we also have like are they really, is that the way these things go, or should we rethink this idea, or should we keep this idea, and or what? Well, I don't want to make a normative statement like that, but just basically like, how does this concept fare? Because not all the concepts that the cyberneticians talked about are like good for like because they talk about things in very general terms, or they might talk about things in ways that are maybe not against what we know now to be the case. they were writing many years ago, and so we know a lot more about. We have more examples. We have more people that have done work in certain areas. Certainly, with respect to like Norbert Wiener's work, we know more about like machines and hybrid machines and those sorts of things. So that's one thing. I mean, yeah, we could explore certain concepts though in the future. I would try to do that. So let's see. Oh, go ahead.
No, feed forward was one of those concepts that I feel like we like it hasn't come up as much in the cybernetics readings. So it was interesting to me that was like a difference between Rosen and other cybernetic views at a really foundational level, it seems. I'm not sure I fully understood the difference between feed forward and feedback here. Like I know what feedback means. I understand when they were talking about how when he was explaining how feedback, a system that operates only on feedback would be reactive, whereas the essence of a feed-forward system is that the present change of state is determined by an anticipated future state derived in accordance with some internal model of the world. I guess like how I wanted to know more about how the anticipated future state drives present behavior. Like how exactly does that act as an input? And I understand that it's like it doesn't violate causality. It's not like something in the future is going backwards in time. It's all in the present moment. But I guess like if anyone has a basic explanation of a feed forward system, if that diverges from what the author says here, I'd be interested.
Well, one example is like these temperature controllers, but now these temperature controllers are connected to the internet. Your thermostat, right? So instead of just having like you've got a sensor, right, that's actually reading inside the house or outside the house. Yeah, you've got a weather forecast that's saying like it's gonna be cold in an hour.
Mm-hmm.
I'm making up stuff, but and so and this usually has something to do with the time, like it needs to turn on the furnace half an hour before. This all sounds ridiculous technologically, but but if we assume that it was so slow, then that kind of but like that's kind of giving it. I'm kind of making up this sensor as opposed to the nice. I like this definition, right? Because it's like it does include biological in the sense that like potentially you've got this internal model. It's not necessarily checking the internet, right? But you are your input, instead of being a real time sensor, is a virtual sensor that is like what's happening an hour from now, right? I don't know if that helps, but
yeah, phrase virtual sensor helps.
Yeah, okay, there you go. Because it's like it is an input, right? So it's kind of being fed into the same machinery, right? But it's like it's not actually checking a current. It's not checking the real time feed. It's checking this virtual feed from the future,
which is generated by the model,
which can be generated by anything. The model, I mean, it could even be because again, a lot of these thermostats actually use a fixed model, and it just says like, hey, it's warmer during the day, so I can shut off, I can shut off at this, like I can shut off early, like again, this isn't like a very smart forecast, but you could say that it's actually looking at this cycle, and it's just phase shifted it over, right? And it's responding to that phase shifted version of it because the furnace is slow. You know what I mean? So it's got to tell the furnace in advance what to do, even though it's kind of a fixed, it's a fixed model. I think I'm making it more complicated.
Well, let's
Yeah,
see. Oh,
Okay. Yeah.
let's go back up a little bit to where they talk about feed forward versus feedback. So feedback is where you have a current state of the system, and you have to then, if you deviate from the desired state, like if your house gets colder than you would like, that you have your thermostat set at, then the feedback control is where you set the thermostat, it gets colder, and then the heater goes on and it warms the room until the thermostat is the desired temperature is met. So there's some like error that needs to be corrected, but it's also dependent on there being fluctuations. So the fluctuation has to occur, and then you get this correction, which means that there's this period where there's this like deviation from the desired state. And so that means that the has to have a tolerance, for error, or for sort of having these fluctuations. If a system doesn't have that tolerance, then it's not a good way to control it, because you have to have like some error before something can happen to correct it. Now, in feed forward, what he said, at least in terms of what Rosen's saying, is that you have these preset behaviors that get emitted in with respect to some target. So it's not like it needs to be regulated. It's that the system knows kind of where it is, and then it emits the right behavior to meet that target. So it would be like if you had like a very high tolerance system where you needed to have like, you couldn't have these fluctuations, and I'm not quite sure maybe what those would be, because like a lot of systems are robust to fluctuations, but you'd have like a signal that's preset that would send out a signal and say, if this condition is met and it's just a little bit above the sort of the baseline, then you send this response and it automatically corrects it. There's no need to get that access that feedback signal, which might take too long or allow the system to deviate too much. So, I mean, if you think about behavior, you can have adaptive behaviors where the behavior is flexible, and depending on the environment, the behavior is constantly changing a little bit to meet the target and bring it back to a baseline. Or you could have a system where you have these pre-programmed behaviors that just meet certain conditions of the environment and then hit the target, and they anticipate those kinds of fluctuations. Maybe in a system where it's very high tolerance, but the environment is very deterministic, that it fluctuates, but it does so in a deterministic manner, where you might have like states where it goes off course, but then those states can be corrected immediately. I mean, this is like something that you have to again map specific systems to really get it. And it's not reactive in the sense that it's always chasing error. It's anticipatory in that it knows what the error is going to be, basically.
I thought the part where they were talking about optimization was interesting. Maybe let's start with this, so we go more in order. So here they're talking about the difference between like a Newtonian dynamical system and an anticipatory system, which I found this really helpful to make this distinction, like at this level. So for a Newtonian dynamical system, which would be like a feedback system. All you need is like what the system is like at a certain time, and then what the system, how the system reacts to that to get to time like t+1. So all you have is the present and past states that are like a part of the system. Whereas an anticipatory system, one of the things that goes into the state at time t+1 is, let's say, like the output of the model about the future, the input from the virtual sensors.
Yeah.
So that's where it's not that there's something traveling back in time. There's nothing that seems like spooky or magical. But the model is forward looking, and so the output of the model is about the future, and that's the way that the future affects the present.
Okay. Yeah. So this is like predicting the future with like a switchboard of things. Like you say, what's the desired output? Here's the input, and then you get to the output. Or I guess that's maybe a weird way to think about it, but so he's building these relational systems. Like he has the MR system, which is the metabolism and repair. So metabolism is the set of behaviors. Repair is a set of outcomes. To get the set of outcomes, you need the set of metabolic behaviors. And so what is that? Those set of relations? And I don't know. Like, I guess that's where they're going with this. It's, yeah. I'm looking at the detail here. So when we proceed to consider systems in terms of relations between input-output pairs and mappings of time, so these happen in time, you have a series of these relations and you just implement them over time. We find that causality needs only dictate natural regularities relating causes and effects, without necessarily including a built-in forward temporal restraint, which is that feedback loop. So you have this, if you overshoot your response, then you correct it, but that's actually not forward-looking because backward-looking because you're trying to compensate for the future or what's happening in the present. Thus, anticipatory behavior not only is possible, but because general input-out relations contain Newtonian dynamics as special cases, it's actually less restrictive and therefore in some sense generic. So I guess I have a question, which is like, how do we know that we have the appropriate set of behaviors? And in a natural system, what would determine that? Is it like prior learning? Or is there some sort of like, does the system have to be a certain way? Like I said, does it have to be deterministic? If you have a heavy stochastic presence, for example, where you have fluctuations of the system itself, and then you have a steady target, then, can you find that set of relations that matches everything? So remember, I think we talked in last week's Cognition Futures about, I don't know if we talked about ergodicity in detail. I don't think we talked about it in detail.
No.
I don't think so. No, we talked about intentionality.
Oh, yeah, that's... so ergodicity is this idea from complex systems, and it has to do with where the system's always matching, or like the input is always matching the output. So there are a lot of systems that are ergodic. Sometimes it means that, all states are sort of equally probable. There are different ways you can define it, but basically the idea is that there's this, ergodicity is the right spelling. So this idea that there's this sort of well-matched aspect to it, and that's the nature of the system. Okay. So mathematics, ergodicity expresses the idea that a point of a moving system, either a dynamical system or a stochastic process, will eventually visit all parts of the space that the system moves in a uniform and random sense. So this is like, if you think about this in terms of matching the input to the output, it's moving along. So the system is moving along with sort of the needs of the environment perfectly. And it's able to do that within any range of the system. So it's not just like a small band. It's this large area that it can do this in. But it's basically tracking the desired state, regardless of any, challenges to the system. So,
So is that supposed to be an anticipatory system?
well, it's not it. Well, maybe the consequence of that, but the idea is that complex systems will do this. Even if the environment's quite noisy or even chaotic, it can still do it. But then the question is, well, how do you do this? And that's where you might come into anticipatory systems, because it's like, okay, well, obviously you need to have the right set of anticipatory states to allow you to do that, right? So that's kind of an idea that we hadn't talked about, I don't think, enough. And like, you can think of that in terms of allostasis. You can think about that in terms of dynamical systems, and you can even think about that here. Because the next step then would be to say, okay, how do you, what kind of thing drives a system like that? How do you maintain ergodicity? And this is, of course, is where they propose that, you have a teleological system that can, either that, or maybe you have a system that's pre-programmed with infinite states, right? Because if you have a very noisy system with those sort of stochastic fluctuations, then you have to have a lot of potential states that you can draw from. Plus, you also have to be able to find those states in the right time. So, like, if I had 10,000 internal states I could emit to match the environment, I would have to know search every one and put them out there and get them right. So then this is where they talk about teleology. And this is the assertion that anticipatory systems involve teleology, or final causes, which means that they work towards the future, or that they know the future, or that they follow this future path. And it's kind of one of these concepts that's pretty controversial, in the sense that it's pretty tempting to think something is teleological. That a very common example is that history unfolds in a certain way, that there's some ultimate thing out there that, like, and it's very tempting to think that way, because we see patterns in history, or we see patterns in evolution, and we see, like, increasing order, or we see certain trends emerge. And we think, well, that was always meant to be, that the system was meant to sort of gravitate towards those places, and we can they were just kind of predestined spots. But of course, we're looking at the system from the benefit of the future, not the benefit of where the system's been. So, if you think about, like, if you were to take a certain perspective on a system, being like, say you were a second order observer in cybernetics, and you were in the thing that's being regulated, then you may have a very different perspective. Maybe that history actually just unfolded this way because it was able to meet the needs of the time, and it ended up in this place. There were certain constraints maybe that didn't allow it to do certain things, and that's that. Jesse had posted something here. Tangent. This also reminds me of the quote Johann would say in the past about vision and boundaries. Quote, "We don't see boundaries, we see with boundaries," which is, you do have, like, this benefit of, like, sort of the past being the way to categorize things. So, like, if we were in an alternate history, we would have a different set of categories, just simply because history might unfold differently. Yeah. And so, go back up to the highlighted area, Amanda. So it goes back to Aristotle with causality. So teleologically and causality are linked, because the idea being that causality is basically the cause of something is preordained, maybe, or that it has, like, there's some reason why their relations or something like that. So in Aristotle's conception of causality, you have 4 distinct kinds of causes for any physical event. So you have, if we kind of fit this to this Newtonian example, we have 3 things here outlined. The first is the initial conditions or the material cause of the event. So we have an initial condition, we start at point, this point, and then we move towards another point. The initial condition causes that outcome. And I don't know if that's the right way to put this because, in complex systems, we talk about sensitivity to initial conditions. But that's only because we have equations that if you start at like some value, plug it in as like t equals 0, then t equals 10,000 will be in a certain place. It's a unique location in phase space. But that path is like totally dependent on the initial condition. It doesn't cause it so much as it's just a consequence of it. Like I generate this set of numbers based on this transformation, and I end up here. And maybe there's variation in it because of the decimal place, but it's not like it doesn't cause it in the sense that I guess you could say that like if I had a 4 available to me instead of a 2, it would cause it to be in one region versus another. But I mean, the material cause is kind of, I don't know, a little bit, I mean, you could argue that this is a play on semantics in some ways, but.
So I heard an explanation of Aristotle's causes. That's the object in question is a table. What causes the table to exist? So the material cause, which this is odd to say that it's a cause, but is the wood. The material cause is the wood that goes into the table. The formal cause, the system's laws, are like the designing of the table. What should the table look like? The efficient cause would be the carpenter working. And then the final cause would be like for the purpose of dining at the table. So I don't know how helpful that is to translate into like dynamic systems language.
Wait a minute, what was the formal cause again?
The formal cause is supposed to be the system's laws. The design of the table.
Okay.
So like, yeah, drawing out what exactly the table should look like. And the efficient cause is the carpentry.
And then the final cause would be like eating at the table or
right. Yeah. You can kind of see how in that example the final cause exists. Like it's kind of it's different than the other 3.
Right.
Very final causes.
Teleology comes in. Sorry, go ahead.
Very eudaimonia, final cause being fulfilled stuff. Like it is fulfilling the purpose by which it was designed thing.
Yeah. It requires like the context and like human agents to kind of make sense of the final cause being dining.
Yeah. And that's maybe the problem with like thinking about teleology outside of like human-made system, but something where you have this very specific function of this was created for this purpose from the beginning. Like, it's like we wanted to build a dining room table, so we brought wood to the thing, and then we, had a design, we have carpentry and all this. It's much different than like if you had pattern formation of some type where you said, you could look at like, we can look at like insect, things like termite mounds and, beehives. And of course, in that case, we have collective behavior of different insects, and they have their own role, and they have, they're building the structure, and it has this, I don't know if there's an architecture that they follow, but they have like certain interaction rules that they follow. So they do their own thing, and they build the structure, and then you end up with these structures that aren't like exacting in terms of their specifications. They actually are pretty good, but they have like this. They're emergent things, and they're different from like building like a house from a set of blueprints. So it's, it's different. Go back up to those 3 points. So we have the initial causes, the constitutive parameters of the system are its efficient causes. So in a lot of dynamical systems, you'll have parameters that govern like the way that a system runs, so we can actually, like in a simulation, we can set the parameters to different levels and the output will be different. So the outcome of the system will be different. And again, this is not like, you're not sending out a set of pre-programmed, signals. You're just simply saying at this parameter value, this is the way the system, this is the outcome of the system. And I'm thinking about this in terms of like a simulation platform, like an agent-based model, where we have like this initial condition, and then we run forward in the simulation a couple thousand iterations, and there are interactions between the agents, and they may like end up building some structure, or they might not. And so, then they're all controlled by parameter values. So you can slide the parameter values backwards and forwards and get a different outcome. And then the system laws are its formal cause. So you observe the system laws from the output. You can set the system. You have to extract the system laws from whatever it's producing. So whatever the simulations produce, then you can say, okay, these are the laws of the system. And if you observe a wider variety of outcomes or outputs, then you have this. And so it's very much like that sort of process, like where you have sort of this input, you have some transformation, and then you have an output, like we talked about with Amanda's example. Okay. So I guess, let's see. Could we go back up to the model, actually? We talked about model, because I think model is, if we talk about the Every Good Regulator Theorem, model is a very important concept, and they talk about it in a very specific way there. So, let's keep in mind like the Every Good Regulator Theorem when we think about this, because that's kind of like, I don't know, I can't remember when Rosen was doing his work. I think it was like maybe contemporaneous with the Every Good Regulator Theorem. So, but so the essential novelty.
This is
yeah.
live.
Oh yeah, I think he published his books in like the 70s or something though. I don't remember exactly when it was. A lot of his stuff was, so yeah, it was probably contemporaneous with that. So the essential novelty in Rosen's approach to anticipatory systems is that he considers them as single entities and relates their overall properties to the character of the models they contain. So that's, so basically they're unified systems, and they have their, overall properties are maybe model specific. So if you have a model of metabolism, it's going to be different than a model of reproduction or some other model. There have, of course, been many approaches to planning, forecasting, and decision making. The tactical aspects, as we talked about. They don't, Rosen's idea isn't tactical, and by tactical it means like, you deploy a certain strategy. You could think about that in terms of reinforcement learning. You could think about that in terms of control theory, where there's a certain control strategy. These are just things that, the ways that they do these things very technically. But in Rosen's case, it's the behavioral correlates arising throughout a system simply from the fact that present behavior is generated in terms of a predictive future situation. So we have a present behavior we observe, but we have to pick a future behavior to match that thing. And so this is different from feedback in the sense that you're not using like an error term or a subtractive term. You're using sort of an affirmative term, but it's also an affirmative term that just kind of like meets it all the way. So it's not a subtle difference, I guess is the point. So it does not consider, for instance, the various procedures of extrapolation and correlation that dominate much of the literature concerned with decision making in an uncertain or incompletely defined environment. So, you don't have like these output functions that show the dynamics, and you don't have that. That's not available to the system. It's not like something you're operating on. So, like, if you were thinking that you could take like an output and get a derivative, and then use that to make a decision, that's not the way this works. This is more like a discrete system or a system of rules, an axiomatic type system, which is interesting because that's very different from control theory in the way that control strategies are implemented. Anticipatory systems is concerned rather with global properties of model-based behavior, regardless of how the model is generated, or indeed of whether it is a good model or not. That's interesting because, again, the good regulator, the good model. The model is, a good model is sort of a good model of a system. So you have to have all the properties of that system well defined to be a good model, right? You have to know, like, you have to be a good mirror, maybe, or you have to have the right structure or whatever. So that, they always put good in quotes. So this is, it's not doing that. It's actually looking at the properties of an anticipatory system, not how to build an anticipatory system. So this is like, I guess maybe kind of like an alternate view of the Every Good Regulator Theorem. It doesn't rely on that mirroring aspect. It doesn't rely on replication of the system to do its job. It just relies on knowing enough about the system to apply these patches to get, to keep it regulated. So a model defined formally is a commutative functorial encoding and decoding between two systems in a modeling relation. So this is mathematics jargon, commutative functorial. So there's reference 6 and reference 7 for the modeling relation. So I don't know if we want to go down to the references real quick and see what those are. Or I guess they're notes, not references.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So yeah, but that's it. For the readers not acquainted with the word functorial, that being a concept from the mathematical theory of categories. So they're actually relying on category theory, not on like discrete systems or even continuous dynamical systems. This is category theory. They may simply take it to mean pertaining to a mapping that takes into account the processes involved in additions to inputs and outputs. So again, you're doing this very simple mathematics, this relational mathematics, saying that this input matches this output, you add those together and you get regulation. And it might require a lot of coordination, but there's a mathematical language for that, at least to describe what's going on. And then this note 7, the topic for this person's tutorial session, FUMI 1, I don't know what that is, some conference, was the modeling relation. There is only room in the present article, however, for a small fraction of that particular exposition. The reader is referred to AS, if a copy can be found. That's the Anticipatory Systems book. I think I actually have a copy of that, so we can get that out. Rosen 1991 and Louie 2009, which are the two citations there, for a detailed treatment of the subject, which is considered by Rosen to be the point of departure of science.
Interesting.
Yeah. Departure as in like how the fields are changing, or like it's not science?
I think I think maybe that those two approaches diverge a bit. So this is actually, figure 2 is good actually to stop at. Because this is the prototypical modeling relation. So this is a category-theoretic view of regulation. So it's very different from the Every Good Regulator Theorem, at least in the way it's formulated. So this, you can see that you have this sort of system of, boxes, which are these discrete states, and you might be tempted to think this is a Markov model, but I don't think it is. I don't think you can describe it. I mean, you could describe it as a Markov model, but that's not what we're seeing here. What we're seeing is a system of two states where you have a natural system and a formal system. And so like this is like the Every Good Regulator Theorem. You have a natural system, which is the thing in nature, and then a formal system, which is the thing you're kind of modeling. And then you have an encoding and a decoding. So you're encoding from the natural system to the formal system. You're decoding out back to the natural system. And these could be the matching aspects of the system of relational relations, I guess. And then you have causal entailment, which is this transition from natural system to natural system. So you have causal aspects, and then you have the inferential entailment in the formal system. So things are causal in the natural system, they're inferential in the formal system. So this bit up above figure 2, he says simulation describes, model explains. A lot of the so-called models in the social sciences are really just sophisticated kinds of curve fitting. So there's simulation. So if you think about like a model for predicting, an economic model maybe, because those are pretty quantitative. And you're trying to predict like production, or you're trying to predict sales, supply and demand curve or something like that. You're basically trying to curve fit, or you're trying to predict things with regressions or things like that. And so, the idea is that you're operating from data, but you can also simulate them. But you have this curve fitting aspect. And so that's really interesting in the sense of like, our paper where we're trying to link the Every Good Regulator Theorem to what are basically exercises in curve fitting, modern machine learning. I said it. Because that's like the criticism of machine learning is it's merely curve fitting a lot of times. But and take that with what you will, but basically that's that's the sort of mode that we have to think in with this kind of models. And with this kind of model, we're not thinking in terms of curve fitting at all. We're thinking in terms of some set of relations. And so we might be able to fit some data with a polynomial, and that polynomial basically, if you think about it in a control systems aspect, it's that trajectory that you're trying to correct for. So if you don't have, that polynomial is a curve fit, so it's an estimate. And of course, with an estimate, there's noise, there's sloppiness. So if you're using like a typical feedback system, you're just trying to match that estimate. So you're trying to match that curve. That's a polynomial. It's pretty rough. And, you get like maybe a pretty good fit, but it's not absolute. So, this is maybe one of the drawbacks of feedback loops is that you're basically trying to find the derivatives for these parts of the polynomial and you can't get there or get there well enough. Yeah, go ahead.
An important thing that's missing from that kind of system is like any kind of understanding of why you go from A to B. Like why does the output follow this pattern? My understanding is that a model would provide some kind of understanding of why you go from A to B. Like why does the curve look that way? And that's what's necessary for the system to be able to anticipate and to be able to be flexible and adaptive.
Yeah. And so like, and a lot of these curves are kind of like, we put a curve, we'll like predict a curve from data and we'll give some parameters and then that's it. And then we don't have any idea why the data does that.
Right.
Like people will say it's linear. Well, why is it linear? And sometimes it's easy to know, but sometimes it's not. A lot of times it's not. Especially if you get a polynomial, because it's like, why does it fluctuate here? And then you'll have people writing papers on why that is, but they may or may not, be correct on that. So yeah, this is an understanding of the sort of the whole output is basically, yeah.
Yeah, because I wanted to just say quickly, like this discussion is really, 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 really good, and I want to go back and like review it and ask a lot of questions about it because this is like the core. This isn't directly talked about in the data science stuff that I'm doing, but it's like all the super adjacent stuff about models. Like, oh, this distribution fits this best, or this model works best here. and it's sort of like the actual analysis part and communication is about this, but it's not necessarily like I'm noticing in the course group that I'm having, some courses are actually about that, where you're trying to describe the like why, like the why is the model, why is the arrow in this direction, why does the regression fit here or not, why is it linear here or not, versus the actual like what the tool is doing, what the statistical framework of the question is and how it fits the data. So like this is like super interesting to me, and I know I'm not saying a lot. I'm really appreciative of this talk specifically.
Yeah, this is good. So yeah, that's a good point from Amanda and Jesse. Yeah, it's definitely a data science thing that people don't talk about so much. And again, it's kind of like machine learning, right? We have a lot of like methods, but it's like what is there's a lot there that we can discuss that people, I don't know if people are interested in discussing it in the field so much, but I think that's why we're writing the paper we're writing right now for that special issue. But anyways, so what do we go back up to the modeling section? That was the one where we were kind of getting into the, yeah, maybe down to those notations. Yeah, right there. So where they talk about modeling relations. So this is Rosen's notation or graphical expressions. They're talking about these modeling relations where you have relations between an input and an output. A modeling relation exists between the natural system N and the formal system F. So we have this natural system. We saw the diagram in figure 2 where we have N and we have F, and there's a connection between them where there is a congruence between their entailment structures. So, there's this idea of congruence. So they have to be congruent. You have to have N, the states in N have to map to the states in F. And that's exactly what's predicted by the Every Good Regulator Theorem. There has to be that sort of isomorphic connection between the states in N and the states in F, or in the states in the real world and the states in the model in the EGRT. A necessary condition for congruence involves all 4 arrows, which are these arrows down below this paragraph. It may be stated as whether one follows path C or path epsilon, or paths epsilon, I or delta, in sequence, one reaches the same destination. So this graphically is C equals epsilon I delta, just in that same direction. So it's the summary of all those. Basically, you can follow path C, and there is an equivalence between that and these alternate paths. This is the expression for that. If this relation is satisfied, we say F is a simulation of N. So the formal system can be simulated, or that the formal system is a simulation of the natural system if it basically mirrors all of the complexity of N, and it has all the states, and you can basically reach the same places. So this is really interesting in terms of modeling and simulation, because we've talked about simulations having this expressivity. So like a agent-based model can model a lot of things from an initial condition. It has these interactions. Can it model all the states that you would like to see? So in other words, if I built an agent-based model of, well, first of all, you could build a generic agent-based model, but most people build these specialized models that are very specific to a problem. And so, but even if I run one of those specific models, say I run an agent-based model of flocking, where you have a bunch of birds and they have interaction rules, and you start with an initial condition, and they have dynamics, they interact, and they're forming these shapes and different structures. Can I replicate all of the paths of interactions that would lead me to all of the states that I might observe in the natural world? So in other words, if I have a model of flocking and I run it enough times and long enough, can I replicate every single behavior that's seen in the natural world, given that you've observed the natural world forever? And the answer is either yes or no. And, I guess I would probably say maybe not, but maybe, I don't know. they're saying that yes, you can achieve that, and that's what they mean by congruence. That, and this is sort of the heart of this anticipatory thing, because if you have that information, if you can simulate the system long enough and know all the states and know all the interactions essentially, then you can have all of the things that you need to have anticipation. So basically the system learns from all of that and it can anticipate something happening. So it's a memory aspect. And I don't know if they mention memory, but that's maybe kind of the thing I'm kind of thinking about in terms of how this is stored, because it's obvious that you need to have this experience of the system running, and that you have to simulate this in a model, and you're extracting basically all this information out of the real world so that you have the grist for this sort of prediction. If the relation is satisfied, we say F is a simulation of N. In addition, inferential entailment I, which is this middle term, it is itself entailed by the encoding epsilon of causal entailment C. So if we have C in parentheses, epsilon, and then I in parentheses. So this is like where we have inferential entailment, which is entailed by the encoding of epsilon of causal entailment C. So you have C, I guess, which causes epsilon, which causes I. So you have this chain of things that go into the inference. If those things are satisfied, we can say that F is a model of N, and N is a realization of F. So we can say that if F is a simulation of N, and then there are other certain conditions, F is also a model of N, and N is then a realization of F. So I guess that's almost like that there's a simulation theory aspect to this. I don't know, it's weird. But it's also saying that there's this reversible mapping between the natural world and the model, which, I mean, I don't know. This is important if you're talking about modeling in like a system like MR, where you have metabolism and repair, and you need to find, like, you don't have the benefit of like offloading to a model. You just basically have to pick something in real time and implement it. So that the reversible is very important. A simulation or process provides an alternate description of the entailed effects, whereas a model is a special kind of simulation that additionally also provides an alternate description of the entailment structure of the mapping, representing the process itself. It is in particular easier to obtain a simulation than a model of a process. That's interesting, but I guess that makes sense, because I could simulate a process without knowing the full details. And then what
One
they're
of the
saying,
examples they give is epicycles. Like that might be a successful simulation.
yeah,
If your model is, if your simulation involves epicycles on epicycles, but it's not a model because, or maybe it's a bad model. I guess that's one thing to maybe tease out. But the epicycles aren't accurate, so they don't give us like a real understanding of the physics.
yeah,
Is it fair to say that how it's being talked about here, that like a simulation is almost like a given certain conditions or whatever, here's how one instance would go, whereas a model would be maybe more like Every Good Regulator Theorem, but more like encompassing of all the different possibilities in it more so? Or is
Well, I
that
think
too
it's
much?
like, I think a simulation would say, oh, you gave me A, here's B, but then a model would say, you give me A, here's B, and here's Y. Like here's why we go from A to B.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, you have to go back to this idea of ergodicity, right? So like a model has ergodicity with respect to the system, whereas a simulation doesn't need to be. It just needs to put out some sort of behavior that looks like it matches the system. And that's just one run of the simulation. So if you run it again with different initial conditions, it gives you different results. That's why you have to observe the simulation for infinite time, maybe, to get these. And that's where you get into this issue of like, how long do you need to run that simulation to have the anticipatory knowledge to do this? That's, I think, one of the issues that's maybe one of the issues that's a problem too, because it's like, okay, well, how long can you, how much information do you actually need to be fully anticipatory, especially if you're doing something like a metabolic set of metabolic pathways where it's just extremely complex, a lot of interactions, a lot of causality potentially. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in here, like a lot of like technical, like it's not category theory, but it's also not formalized.
Right. Yeah, I think we definitely should spend one more meeting on this. I think just one more. It's not a very long paper, but
Yeah.
I'd like to maybe spend some time on that figure, because that is supposed to be the anticipatory system.
Yeah.
And eventually they talk about like getting back to organisms in the real world.
Yeah, let's start at the model, or let's start at the errors section. Maybe you can make a note of it in the paper.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to like process a lot of this meeting because it's sort of bumming up on like causality and everything else and for data science stuff, but I'm learning also like the analytics or the actual analyzing process too, and how causality does you think of that? So I don't. Oh, maybe I can like review this or download it and listen to it on the flight or something. But I look forward to doing that next time. I don't think we're gonna try to meet for this group next Thursday, but we could. If we do, I'll try to make it. If I'll be like midnight, but I'll try to do it probably. Or we can just wait until 2 weeks. But I definitely do want to continue doing this quickly.
Let's just plan on 2 weeks.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, regarding your note, I definitely think the normative turn stuff is relevant here.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. I put things in the chat when we were kind of getting into that. Just to put this in just as quickly as I can before we go, I put it in my own notes for next time too. But I'm so glad we read the biology of cognition paper because I didn't realize how fundamental that would be in like its pre-enactive, pre-everything's. Just to see it kind of like as this. It was pretty raw, but it also really crisp about what I was trying to say. And then there's things that, like it's these things that, like these derivative things off of it that happen. And this whole normative term, I think, happens, downstream of it, but then it's sort of pushing back into it. Like the eruption theory itself is interesting. I'm really not sure how to feel about it yet. I think I saw around this question in the Slack, and I think it's a good question. I think I know what the answer kind of is. Yeah. But that'll be fun to play with. There's this broader philosophical thing about like where is the meaning relative to the observation of the system, and I'm really excited to be building more language around that because, interestingly enough, like it's almost like a abstract version of the same things I'm coming up with in the data ethics class, which is about data ethics, but is also really about communicating in and around the science or the science and the modeling itself. And it's interesting because that's actually one of the more applied courses, as much as it doesn't sound like it's actually a much more applied course in communicating about these things, and I'm seeing it super relevant to that. So a lot about that ahead, but I really appreciate the discussion here and look forward to next week and step 2 for next meetings. Yeah, really good stuff.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, yeah. Thanks for meeting.
See you all next time.
See you next time.
Yeah, talk to you soon.
Bye.
Take care.
Take care.